The obsidian fortress floated in the dead space between dying stars, a monument to fear carved from black stone and bitter metal. No sunlight had ever touched its walls. No warmth had ever blessed its corridors, built to contain the galaxies. Most dangerous beings, it was a tomb for the living, a place where hope came to die. In the deepest chamber of this fortress, behind walls thick enough to stop starship cannons, lived a legend that mothers used to frighten children into sleep. They called him Drakner, the world ender, the crimson dragon whose flames had once turned 3 solar systems into ash. His massive form filled the entire cell. Wings that could blot out moons now folded tight against walls that wept with condensation. From his breath, for 200 years, he had not moved except to breathe. The guards who watched him through reinforced windows spoke in whispers, crossing themselves with protective charms their grandmothers had taught them. They said his golden eyes saw through time itself, that his roar could crack planets, that his fire burned hotter than the cores of stars. But the guards were wrong about many things. They did not know that Drakner wept in the darkness when no one was watching. They did not know that his dreams were filled not with conquest, but with a small human child he had failed to protect long ago. They did not know that the monster they feared had once chosen love over war, and that choice had cost him everything. The fortress operated with mechanical precision. Shift changes happened every 6 hours. Meal deliveries followed strict schedules. Security sweeps covered every inch of the prison twice daily. Nothing unexpected ever happened in the Obsidian Fortress. Nothing ever changed until the day Kestra. Vane walked through the front door. She was 8 years old, the copper hair that caught what little light existed in the dim corridors in green. Eyes that seemed to see through the darkness itself. She wore a simple blue dress that was too big for her small frame, and her feet were bare against the cold metal floors. No alarms sounded when she passed through the security checkpoints. No guard stopped her as she walked deeper into the fortress than any civilian had ever been allowed, Captain Thorne. The fortress warden was reviewing prisoner files in his office when his security chief burst through the door, his face pale with confusion. "Sir, we have a situation. There's a child in Sector 7. Thorne looked up from his papers, frowning. "A child? That's impossible. Run a full system check." "Someone's playing games with the cameras." "Sir, I've run 3 checks. The readings are real. She's heading toward the maximum security levels." Thorne stood, his chair scraping against the floor. In 20 years of running the Obsidian Fortress, nothing like this had ever happened. Children did not simply appear in maximum security prisons. Children did not walk through energy barriers designed to stop armies, seal all corridors leading to the deep cells, deploy security teams to intercept. But even as he gave the orders, Thorne felt a strange chill run down his spine. Something was different about this day. The air itself seemed to hum with an energy he had never felt before. 3 levels below, Kestra continued her journey through the fortress, following something only she could sense. The guards she passed seemed to freeze when she looked at them, their hands falling away from their weapons, their voices caught in their throats. She did not run or hide. She simply walked with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged exactly where she was. The deeper she went, the stronger the pull became. It was like following a song only she could hear, a melody of sadness and longing that seemed to echo from the very bones of the fortress. The other prisoners watched her pass their cells with wonder, pressing their faces to the energy barriers that contained them. Some whispered prayers in languages she did not understand. Others wept without knowing why. Finally, she reached the bottom of the fortress, where the air was so thick with despair it was hard to breathe. Here, behind a door marked with warnings in 17 different languages, lay the cell that contained Drakner, the world ender. Kestra approached the massive door and placed her small hand against the cold metal. Through the barriers, through the walls, through 2 centuries of pain and isolation, she felt him. The great dragon, who had once soared between stars, now curled in darkness like a broken bird. She pressed her forehead against the door and whispered a single word that had never been spoken in that place before. "Papa." Inside the cell, something stirred that had not moved in decades. Golden eyes that had been closed in endless sleep suddenly opened, not with rage or hunger, but with recognition. Drakner lifted his massive head, nostrils flaring as he caught a scent that should not have existed, could not have existed, but there it was. The scent of innocence and love, of a child who had never learned to fear monsters, of a daughter he thought he had lost forever. The dragon's heart, silent for so long that many believed it had turned to stone, began to beat again. Each pulse sent ripples through the fortress's foundation, causing lights to flicker and walls to tremble. Captain Thorne felt it in his office, a rhythm like distant thunder that seemed to come from the earth itself. His security teams reported strange readings from the deep cells, energy spikes that their instruments could not explain. "Sir," came a voice over the intercom, tight with fear. "The world ender is moving." Thorne's blood turned to ice. In 2 decades, Drakner had never moved except to breathe. The dragon's stillness had become so absolute that some guards wondered if he had died and no one had noticed. Locked down everything, full containment protocols. Now, the containment was no longer possible. Kestra's presence had awakened something that had been sleeping for too long. The barriers that held Drakner were designed to contain a monster. It's not a father who had just heard his child's voice calling through the darkness. The energy fields around his cell began to fluctuate, their humming growing louder and more erratic. Cracks appeared in the walls as Drakner slowly, carefully began to move. He did not thrash or roar, simply turned toward the door where Kestra waited, his movements deliberate and gentle despite his enormous size. Outside the cell, Kestra felt his presence growing stronger. She could sense his confusion, his disbelief, his desperate hope that this was not just another dream sent to torment him. She pressed both hands against the door and spoke again, her voice carrying through metal and energy and time itself. "Found you, Papa. I found you." The barriers failed all at once, not destroyed, but simply dismissed by a power greater than the technology that had created them. The massive door groaned open, revealing the interior of a cell that had not seen light in centuries. And there, in the darkness, Kestra saw him. Drakner the World Ender was not the monster from the stories. He was ancient and scarred, his crimson scales dulled by centuries of captivity, his wings bearing the marks of chains that had bound him for too long. But when he looked at Kestra with eyes that held the wisdom of ages and the pain of loss, she saw not a destroyer of worlds, but a lonely father who had been waiting for her to come home. She walked into the cell without fear, her small feet making no sound on the cold floor. Drakner lowered his great head until it was level with hers, his breath warming her face as she reached out to touch the scars on his snout. "You're not scary," she said softly. "You're just sad." And for the first time in 200 years, Drakner, the World Ender, wept tears of joy. Above them, alarms screamed throughout the obsidian fortress. Captain Thorne's security teams surrounded the cell, weapons drawn, not understanding what they were seeing. A little human girl standing before the galaxy's most feared creature, her hand resting gently on his nose as he cried. The fortress shook as other dragons across the galaxy felt Drakner's awakening, their own long-dormant hearts beginning to remember what they had lost. Ships in distant sectors reported strange energy readings as creatures thought extinct began to stir. But in that moment, in that cell where love had conquered fear, none of that mattered. Kestra climbed onto Drakner's neck, settling against the warm scales as if she had done it 1,000 times before. "I missed you, Papa," she whispered, and the dragon who had once burned worlds held her as gently as a snowflake, protecting the one light that had survived in his darkness. The galaxy would never be the same. The alarms of the obsidian fortress screamed across 17 star systems, their shrill cry carrying a message that no military commander wanted to hear. The World Ender had awakened, and he was no longer alone. Captain Thorne stood frozen outside the cell, his weapon trembling in his hands as he watched the impossible scene before him. Kestra sat curled against Drakner's massive neck, her small fingers tracing the ancient scars on his scales, while the dragon's golden eyes watched the guards with a mixture of sadness and warning. There was no rage in those eyes, no hunger for destruction, but there was something far more dangerous. there was purpose. "Sir," whispered Sergeant Mace, his voice barely audible over the alarms. "What are your orders?" Thorn could not answer. His training had prepared him for riots, for escape attempts, for every possible scenario except this one. No protocol existed for a child who had somehow bypassed every security system in the galaxy's most secure prison to reunite with a dragon, who had not moved in 2 centuries. Above them, in the command center of the fortress, General Corvin received the emergency transmission with the cold fury of a man who had built his career on control. His scarred face, marked by battles across 3 galactic wars, twisted into a snarl as he absorbed the reports flooding in from his subordinates. "A child," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos of the control room like a blade. "You're telling me that a single human child has compromised the most secure facility in known space?" "Sir, the readings are off the charts," reported his aide, sweat beading on her forehead. "The dragon's biosignature is spiking. Energy levels we've never recorded before. And sir, there's something else." Corvin turned, his cybernetic eye worry as it focused on the young officer. "We're detecting movement in 17 different sectors. Other dragons, sir? They're waking up." For the first time in his military career, General Corvin felt genuine fear. The dragons had been hunted nearly to extinction for good reason. A single awakened dragon could level a city. Multiple dragons acting in coordination could end civilizations. "Initiate Protocol Omega," he commanded. "Prepare the fortress for total sterilization." But as his fingers moved toward the activation keys, every screen in the command center flickered and died. Emergency lighting bathed the room in crimson as backup systems struggled to compensate for a power drain that should have been impossible. Deep in the cell, Drakner had begun to sing. It was not a sound that human ears were designed to hear, a bass note so deep it resonated through the metal bones of the fortress itself. The song was older than empires, older than the wars that had driven his kind. To the edge of extinction, this was a call that had not been heard in the galaxy for 300 years. Kestra felt the vibration through his scales, a rumbling purr that seemed to speak directly to her soul. She understood somehow that he was not singing to her, but through her, using her presence to amplify a message across the void between stars. "What is he doing?" Captain Thorn asked, his voice tight with growing panic. Before anyone could answer, the fortress shook as something massive struck the outer hull. Then another impact, and another, until the entire structure rang like a bell under assault from unseen forces. "Sir," came a frantic voice over the intercom. "We have multiple contacts approaching. Big ones. They're not showing up on our sensors properly, but visual confirms at least 12 large objects heading straight for us." General Corvin's blood turned to ice as he realized what was happening. The other dragons were not just waking up. They were coming. The first to arrive was Vesa Nightwing, Drakner's sister, her obsidian scales seeming to drink the light from the stars around her. She had been hiding in the asteroid fields of the Crimson Nebula for decades, nursing wounds, both physical and spiritual, waiting for a sign that the age of hiding was over. Behind her came others. Thornscale the Ancient, whose green hide bore the scars of 1,000 battles. Mistrala Cloudbreaker, her silver wings spanning wider than most battleships. Dragons who had been presumed dead, who had lived as legends whispered by spacers in the dark corners of the galaxy, now emerging from their hiding places to answer Drakner's call. They did not attack the fortress. They surrounded it, their massive forms creating a living barrier between the prison and the naval fleets that were already mobilizing in response to the crisis. Their eyes, like burning stars in the void, watched and waited inside his cell. Drakner's song changed, becoming gentler as he felt his kin gathering around him. Kestra looked up at his massive face, seeing tears of joy flowing down scales that had known only sorrow for so long. "They came for you," she whispered. "No, little star." Drakner spoke for the first time in 2 centuries, his voice like distant thunder wrapped in silk. "They came for you. You are the bridge between what was and what could be." The words reached every corner of the fortress through the communication systems that still functioned, carried by harmonics in his voice that no human technology could block. In that moment, every guard, every prisoner, every soul within the obsidian fortress heard the truth that had been hidden. For 300 years, the dragons had not been the monsters. They had been the Guardian's captain. Thorn's hands shook as memories surfaced. Fragments of stories his grandmother had told him as a child. Tales of the old days, when dragons and humans had lived in harmony, when the great beasts had served as protectors of the innocent rather than destroyers of worlds. The war, he whispered. It was all lies. Kestra slipped down from Drakner's neck and walked toward the cell entrance, her bare feet silent on the metal floor. The guards stepped aside without thinking, their weapons lowering as she passed. When she reached Captain Thorn, she looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom far beyond her years. "He's not a prisoner anymore," she said simply, "and neither are you." Before Thorn could respond, the fortress shuddered again as General Corvin's sterilization protocol activated. Hidden weapons systems throughout the structure began charging, preparing to turn the entire prison into a nuclear fireball that would eliminate the dragon threat once and for all. But Drakner was no longer the broken creature who had surrendered himself to captivity centuries ago. The presence of his daughter, the gathering of his kin, the remembrance of his true purpose had restored something that his captors thought they had destroyed forever: his power. The Crimson Dragon stood slowly, its massive frame unfolding like a mountain coming to life. His wings, cramped from centuries of confinement, spread wide and began to glow with an inner fire that had nothing to do with destruction and everything to do with protection. "Little star," he said to Kestra, his voice filled with gentle authority, "it is time to show the galaxy what we truly are." Kestra nodded and placed her hand on his leg. The moment their skin touched, the entire fortress was bathed in golden, light as their bond resonated through the metal and stone around them. The sterilization weapons powered down, their targeting systems unable to lock onto something that registered not as a threat but as hope itself. "General." Corvin watched his screens flicker back to life, showing him readings that made no scientific sense. The dragon's energy signature was off the charts, but it was not the chaotic, destructive force he had expected. It was harmonized, controlled, purposeful. "Sir," his aide reported, her voice filled with wonder. "The other prisoners?" Singing. Throughout the fortress, beings from 100 different worlds had begun to hum along with Drakner's ancient melody. Criminals and political prisoners, pirates and rebels, all joined their voices to a song that spoke of redemption and second chances. Outside, the circle of dragons began to move. Not in attack formation, but in a complex dance that had not been performed since the early days of galactic civilization. Their movements created patterns of light against the darkness of space. A living constellation that spelled out messages of peace in scripts older than any current empire. And at the center of it all, Drakner emerged from his cell with Kestra. Riding on his back, her small form dwarfed by his magnificence, but somehow the most important thing in the entire galaxy. As they rose through the shattered remains of his prison, other dragons fell into formation around them, not as an army, but as a family reunited after too many years apart. The transformation was beginning, and nothing would ever be the same. 3 months after the breaking of the Obsidian Fortress, Ambassador Rillan stood at the observation deck of the Unity Station. Watching as dragons and human children played together in the zero-gravity gardens, his weathered hands, marked by years of diplomatic service, trembled slightly as he held the datapad containing Kestra's true heritage. She was not just any human child who had somehow formed a bond with Drakner. She was his daughter, not by blood, but by choice. 20 years ago, when Rillan had served as the peace envoy between the Human Colonial Alliance and the Dragon Clans, he had witnessed something that changed the course of galactic history. Drakner, the World Ender, the most feared warrior of his people, had knelt before a dying human diplomat and accepted guardianship of her unborn child. That child was Kestra. The war that followed had scattered them across the galaxy. Rillan had managed to get the baby to safety, placing her with foster families who moved frequently to avoid detection. He had told himself it was for the best, that keeping her hidden would protect her from those who would use her as a weapon or a symbol. But Kestra had found her way home anyway, drawn by bonds deeper than space and time. "Papa Relin," came a familiar voice behind him. Kestra floated through the observation deck's entry hatch, her copper hair drifting around her face like a halo in the station's artificial gravity. Behind her came Drakner, his massive form somehow, moving with perfect grace through corridors designed for beings a fraction of his size. "Hello, little star," Relon said, turning to embrace the girl who had changed everything. "How are your lessons with the Dragon Elders?" "Vesa says I'm learning the old songs too quickly," Kestra replied, settling onto a cushion that had been specially placed for her visits. "She thinks I knew them before I was born." Drakner's golden eyes met Ryland's over Kestra's head, and in that gaze the ambassador saw both gratitude and gentle reproach. The dragon had forgiven him for the separation, but the pain of those lost years would always remain. "The High Council has reached a decision," Relin said carefully. "Queen Valeria has agreed to the formal recognition of the Dragon Accords. It was the news they had all been hoping for. After months of tense negotiations, the human government had finally acknowledged what the galaxy had witnessed at the Obsidian Fortress. The dragons were not monsters to be feared or weapons to be contained. They were partners in a covenant older than recorded history. "And the others?" Drakner asked, his voice carrying harmonics that made the station's walls hum softly. 14. "Different species have signed preliminary agreements," Rillan replied. "Zephyrian Collective, the Crystalline Hegemony, even the Voidwalkers have expressed interest in joining the new alliance." Kestra clapped her hands together, her joy infectious. "Even in the serious atmosphere of diplomatic discussion? That means no more prisons like the fortress, right? No more dragons hiding in the dark?" "No more hiding," Drakner confirmed, lowering his great head to nuzzle her gently. "Your courage has given us back our place among the stars. The transformation had not been easy. There had been resistance from military factions who saw the awakened dragons as a threat to human supremacy. There had been fear from civilian populations who had grown up on stories of draconic destruction. There had been political maneuvering and corporate interests trying to find ways to exploit or control the ancient beings. But for every voice raised in opposition, there were 10 more inspired by the image of a small human girl riding on the back of a dragon, showing the galaxy that love was stronger than fear. Captain Thorne, now serving as the director of the new Interspecies Rehabilitation Center, had become one of their strongest advocates. The former prison warden had seen firsthand what happened when beings were judged by their capacity for destruction rather than their potential for growth. General Corvin, stripped of his command and facing trial for attempting to execute a genocide, protocol remained defiant to the end. But his voice was increasingly alone in a galaxy that was learning to see wonder where it had once seen only threat. "There's something else," Roland said, his voice growing serious. "The Deep Space Observatory has detected signals from the far rim. The same harmonics that the dragons use in their songs." Drakner's expression grew thoughtful. "The ancients, you think so? After 3,000 years of silence, they're responding to the awakening?" Kestra looked between the two adults, her young mind grasping implications that seasoned diplomats were still struggling to understand. "More friends?" "Perhaps," Drakner said carefully. "The ancients were old when my people were young. If they are returning, it means the galaxy is ready for the next phase of its evolution." As if summoned by their conversation, Vesa Nightwing glided into the observation deck, her obsidian scales reflecting the starlight streaming through the windows. Behind her came other members of the Dragon Council, their diverse forms filling the space with a majesty that took the breath away. "The children are ready," Vesa announced, her voice like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. Through the observation windows, they could see the next generation taking their first steps into a transformed galaxy. Human children who had been selected for their empathic abilities were learning to communicate with young dragons through bonds similar to the one Kestra shared with Drakner. It was not magic, but something deeper. A connection that transcended species and spoke to the fundamental unity of all conscious life. "They'll be the first dragon riders in 300 years, Kestra said, her eyes shining with pride for her. "Fellow ambassadors, they'll have the best teacher," Drakner replied, his warm breath stirring her hair, as the sun of Unity Station's home system began to set. Painting the observation deck in shades of gold and crimson, the assembled beings fell into comfortable silence. They were witnessing the birth of a new age, one where the ancient partnerships between species could be restored and strengthened. Kestra yawned, the day's excitement finally catching up with her. Drakner curled his massive form around her favorite resting spot, creating a warm nest where she could sleep safely. As her breathing deepened into the rhythm of dreams, the dragon began to hum one of the old lullabies, his voice joined by his sister and the other elders in harmonies that had once echoed across entire star systems. Ambassador Roland watched them, with tears in his eyes, remembering the terrified child he had helped to hide and seeing the confident young woman she was becoming. Kestra Vane, the bridge builder, the dragon speaker, the little girl who had walked into the galaxy's darkest prison and emerged with its greatest treasure, hope. In the months that followed, the changes accelerated. Dragon academies opened on dozens of worlds, teaching the old ways alongside new sciences. Human settlements in previously dangerous sectors found themselves protected by guardians whose scales gleamed in the light of alien suns. Trade routes that had been plagued by pirates for generations became safe passages under the watchful eyes of creatures who could cross interstellar distances in the time it took a ship to charge its hyperdrives. The galaxy had found its balance again, and at the heart of it all was a simple truth that an 8-year-old girl had understood from the beginning. Every monster had once been someone's child, and every child deserved to be loved. As Kestra slept in the warmth of Drakner's protective embrace, her dreams were filled with visions of the future. Dragons and humans exploring distant galaxies together, ancient wisdom guiding new discoveries, and love conquering every form of fear the universe could create. The age of hiding was over. The age of wonder had begun, and it all started with a little girl who was brave enough to call a dragon papa. The end.